Well, hi everyone. My name's Paul Ryan. I'm the Director of the Australian Resilience Centre based here in Victoria, Australia, and I'm co-presenting this session with Nadia. Nadia's already introduced the kind of broad setup here around the scoping phase as part of a broader resilience assessment. What are we trying to achieve when we're doing a scoping phase and the broad process that we might go through. What I'm going to talk about is some of the tools that we might then move into using, and particularly tools that are applicable to participatory processes, so things that we would use with groups of people from within the systems that we're interested in. These tools really broadly can be thought of in two groups. The first I'd say is just a broader exploratory mapping process or broader exploratory kind of work as a part of that initial scoping process. And the other group are tools that are much more sort of issues orientated. So this is where perhaps the resilience assessment starts around a particular issue, like for example, declining fish stocks or overgrazing of particular systems. In that case, we might be starting with that issue and starting with the stakeholders that are most concerned about that issue. And so these approaches that I'll talk about sort of, you would select a particular approach depending on the context that you're working in. So is this just a broader, more exploratory resilience assessment, or are we starting with a sort of known issue and known stakeholders around that issue? So I want to talk about three different types of tools. All of these tools can be used in any circumstance, but as I say, there's a particular kind of focus, if you like, of these two, the participatory SES mapping and what's called the 3Ls tool. They're really good in that exploratory phase. In that sort of broad phase, you may not understand or know what the issues are yet. And so these are really good conversation starters and good ways to work with groups to explore the dynamics, to start to understand the broad dynamics of the system, start to scope, and particularly starting to think about boundaries. And then this third tool here that I want to talk about is this resilience snapshots tool. And that's a really useful tool for this very specific issue where you know what the issue is to start with. So the first one I'm going to talk about is participatory mapping. And there's lots of ways to do participatory mapping. It's a really well-known technique. But the really key here is this part, the social ecological system part. And so that draws our attention, if you like, into the idea that we're talking not just about the social system, but about the ecosystems that people interact with. And typically this process would start, certainly the way we've done it in the past, is to start with just some maps of the region or the area that we're talking about, and starting conversations over those maps and around those maps about what I like to think of as kind of like the services that people are using. And they might be the ecosystem services. So what ecosystem services are people dependent on, and where do they originate, or what area do they span? Or it may also include things like the technology and infrastructure that's important. So you might be talking about roads, access roads into forest areas, or you may be talking about irrigation supply, canals, those sorts of things. And just starting a really broad conversation of mapping those things down. And then you can get more specific. So you can start to say, which groups are using what services, or which groups are using parts of this landscape, and physically mapping where those groups are and the resources that they're relying on. You can also have the same type of conversation about just ecosystems. What are the broad ecosystem types here? So are we talking about floodplains versus foothills? Are we talking about uplands and lowlands? Are we talking about large wetlands? Are we talking about deltas? And starting to put those boundaries of those systems on the map. And essentially by building up layers over time in the discussion and just recording those things as we go through a series of questions, recording those layers, we start to build up a picture. That picture will always be partial because it's very driven by the people who are around the table or in the process with you. And so we don't want to sort of fix boundaries very solidly, very quickly. It's best to keep boundaries sort of loose, but you're starting to build up a picture here. What is this system, and who interacts with this system and within this system and in what ways? That process can be repeated again and again with other groups around the system that you're interested in, or at scales above and below. So you might go to individual farmers, you might go to people in some sort of catchment or water catchment groups, you might go to people in various administrative bodies to get their picture of what they think the landscape is and how they think people interact with that landscape. Over time and over conversations, by building up these layers, we start to see a sort of pattern start to emerge, a pattern of usage, a pattern of interaction with the landscape, with ecosystems. And from that, then we can start to put these broader kind of boundaries. And sometimes we might see multiple boundaries that are really important, and we might see multiple scales that become important. It's important not to rush to try to kind of, quickly map and fix a boundary. The boundary should always be fuzzy. And you can see here from this example that's on screen now, this is the output of exactly the process I just talked about. So sitting down with farmers, administrators, traditional owners, ecologists, and starting to map parts of the landscape. And you can see here, this is a very long, narrow water catchment. And you can see it spans from the uplands through to the sort of more broad, expansive kind of areas. The uplands are high rainfall, smaller property size, lots of conservation reserves. So a very different sort of landscape, and you can see that it's sort of identified out. We've also got a large urban area in this particular region, and so it sits in the middle. You can see there, a large urban area through to right up the left-hand end, which is these broad, expansive agricultural regions. And so by just doing the exact process I talked about, we can sort of build up this picture, and then we can start to look at, okay, our whole focal system here has actually got a number of subsystems in this case. And they're in themselves local social ecological landscapes. So we were working at a very large scale in this case. You might be working at a much smaller scale, but nevertheless, you'll start to see these patterns emerge, and then don't hold those boundaries too tightly. Think about them as kind of fuzzy boundaries. And then from there, we can start to move into some more detailed kind of conversations. That leads us on to this second tool, which is what we call the 3 L's tool. And the L's stand for landscape. So for landscapes, livelihoods, and lifestyles. So you can see the obvious breakdown here. Landscapes, the physical landscape. Livelihoods, how do people make a living? How do they survive and live in this landscape? What resources do they use or depend on? And then lifestyles, which is sort of around how is the social system organised? What are the relationships between different social groups, etc. This is a really simple tool to use as a starting kind of conversation. So rather than the participatory mapping, which involves a fair bit of work and sitting down and spending a fair bit of time, this is a sort of quicker version, if you like, of the participatory mapping, and something that can be done in a relatively short conversation with lots of different people. And the way I would typically do this is to start a conversation about one of these 3, and it doesn't matter which 3. It may be that it's becomes apparent as soon as you start having a conversation with people. They might be talking very much about livelihoods, about the existence of particular livelihoods or the need to maintain livelihoods. And so that's the obvious place to start that conversation. Okay, how do people make their living here? How do they make money? What resources are they dependent on in terms of livelihoods? And whether that's economic livelihoods or whether it's subsistence, it doesn't matter. We're still saying, what are we dependent on in this place for these particular groups or different individuals or different family groups or different communities, etc. So depending on what scale that we're interested in. The important thing though is, even if you start with livelihoods, is actually then to move around to the other 2 to make sure we're covering all those bases. So we would then move to landscapes or to lifestyles. And lifestyles might seem like a funny kind of word. We're not talking about, lifestyles of the rich and famous here. We're talking about how do people live in this place? How are they socially organised? What religious or cultural practices are significant or places that are significant? It's really around that sort of more, the more social part, if you like, of people's lives rather than the economic part or the way that they survive. This is much more around those other things that people need to survive, connection to other humans, spiritual inspiration and connection, the ability to interact with other groups of people and etc. And of course landscapes, and that's clearly, obviously about the ecosystems that people are dependent on or that they interact with. And that may be really broad, so we might be just talking about very broad kind of mapping of those ecosystems, or it may be just a list of things that people think are important from an ecological or environmental point of view. And it may also bring up things that are important in terms of the dynamics of those ecosystems. So just as part of those conversations, people might be starting to talk about things like drought or flooding, or they might be talking about a disease that affects the forests, or they might be talking about the potential for something like foot and mouth disease to impact on their cattle production or whatever it might be. So you will see, obviously, these kind of linkages start to appear through those conversations between these three things. And that's what you'd expect, of course, because in people's minds, the system that they're living in and working in and interacting with is all integrated. And what we're trying to do is to tease out that kind of integrated mental model and to just tease it into its component parts so that we can have more of a conversation and we can start to understand the relationships and interactions. So even at this early stage of a scoping conversation about a social ecological system, we're always listening for things that are important about dynamics. And some of the thinking behind that, why do people think that's happening or whatever. So while we're having these broad conversations about scoping, we can also be having, an ear out for things that become important later on in terms of the system dynamics. So these two tools, participatory mapping and landscape, this 3Ls tools, they're really good, as I said earlier, in terms of just exploratory conversations, and they're good to use early on in these kind of conversations before you really have a clear picture of what is the social ecological system, and start to form, like I say, these sort of fuzzy boundaries. These are always sort of partial and always kind of a temporary sort of understanding of the system, because as you go through, the next phases in the resilience assessment, other things will crop up that will come back to, and you might come back to these and say, hey, hang on, we didn't understand fully that picture when we talked to that group or this group. We only had part of the understanding. And so you might find yourself coming back to the work that you've done here to adjust those boundaries and to refine the thinking that you had earlier on. So hold the outputs of these fairly lightly until you get later into the process, where you can then start to feel a bit more confident. Have we understood this system? Have we got a more complete picture now that we've gone through some more detail later on when we're talking about dynamics? And from there, you might come back and refine the boundaries. So always think of it as sort of partial knowledge, temporary kind of understanding, and hold those ideas fairly lightly. Don't jump to conclusions too early. This last tool I want to talk about is a kind of an idea that we developed to help us to explore issues when someone comes to a resilience assessment process with a particular issue in mind. So they might be driven by a particular event or a particular issue that's having an ongoing impact. So things like overgrazing of a wetland. So they might come to the resilience assessment with that issue as the primary issue that they want to focus on and talk about. Now, as you work through a resilience assessment, of course, that understanding of that issue will be broadened into a more systemic context. It will be put into a context of the whole social ecological system. But as a starting point, if that's where people are at, then it's useful just to stay with that and to start with that energy around that particular issue, because that sort of, if you like, gives you a foothold into the system to understanding it. And of course, as we go through, like I say, the understanding will broaden and deepen. This idea, this tool, the Resilience Snapshot, which we'll circulate a little example of, is really useful for when someone has that kind of particular issue. And it really relies on, it's drawn from a metaphor of using different lenses, in particular kind of the idea of a camera lens. And so what we would say is start with this particular lens on. So you're going to start with the issue of, here's a little picture of the issue that they're particularly concerned about. Now, say it might be the issue is, overgrazing in this particular landscape, and so there's this livestock is overgrazing the pastures or the wetland example, as an example. And what I would say is, using the kind of metaphor idea is get people to describe the picture that they've got in their mind about what that problem is or what that issue is. If you actually have pictures, that's even better, and you could do this using cameras. I've never done that myself, but there's no reason why you couldn't encourage people to take lots of photos of the issues that they see related to this, broader natural resource management issue that they're concerned about. And so that first point is just to sort of say, okay, here's the issue. That's the picture of the issue as it stands at the moment. We can then ask a really kind of simple question, which is, using the metaphor of cameras, is to say, let's zoom in. Let's zoom in very tightly on this issue and see what's actually going on at the micro level when we zoom in. So what's the actual issue here if we zoom in really closely? Well, the basic issue is livestock are overgrazing wetlands and they're eating a particular type of plant, or particular plants that are of interest, of conservation interest or cultural interest to particular groups of people. So it's not just grazing in a wetland, it's grazing a particular plant species in the wetland. That's that first zoom in. And that helps us, that subtly changes the picture a little bit, the picture of this problem. So it's not just grazing, it's grazing of particular species that's of concern. The next thing we can ask is, well, okay, let's do the opposite now. Let's zoom out a bit. So let's look at the broader landscape around, and so zoom back, pull back from the picture and say, what's going on in the other ecosystems around, or how is this ecosystem related to the irrigation systems, or how does it relate to the infrastructure that's around this place, or whatever it might be. So we're just developing a broader picture of this grazing issue by looking at that issue at a different scale. And this Resilience Snapshot tool is really about helping people to understand the notion or the concept of scales. So we're saying pull back out here, zoom out. And that might reveal something different about that issue when you start to pull out. It may be that actually the reason that people are overgrazing the wetland is because their grazing system up here in the foothills is actually declining, and so what they're doing is moving their cattle into the wetlands, and there's too many livestock ending up in the wetlands at particular times of the year. So we're starting to create a better or a broader picture of the issue. The grazing, the overgrazing that's happening in the wetlands is actually being driven by what's happening at a broader scale. So the decline in pasture quality in the foothills is causing farmers at particular times of the year to move more livestock into the lowlands, into the wetlands, and that's what's driving the particular issue in the wetlands. We can then use another kind of camera metaphor here, which is to say, okay, let's look at some slow motion here. What actually happened prior to this? So what's the historical kind of process here? And you might even want to delve into a more detailed historical timeline. And it could be that this is a point where you actually say, let's understand what happened historically. We'll go over here and use another tool, an historical timeline tool. If you haven't got time for that, then just understanding what was the history, what happened in this system up till now, that might help you to understand when did this shift occur, when did farmers start to move their cattle, and that might reveal that in the past, actually, the farmers up here stayed up here all year round and they didn't move their cattle, but that only became more popular in the early 2000s after some major droughts or whatever it might be. So we're building up this picture, and a picture of both the place and the dynamics. And so that's developing a broader understanding of the social ecological system by zooming out. We can then talk about a time lapse. So again, drawing on the camera metaphor, let's do a little time lapse here and see what could the future look like. And let's say, what could it look like in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, if we don't deal with this problem? So just by sort of casting forward a bit, again, that might help us to understand what is this system, what's important about this system. And so this is all helping us to kind of build up a picture of this system, to build up a picture of the boundaries of the system, and the dynamics of the system. And so we're learning about the system as we go through this. We can also use the camera metaphor to go to the sort of very extreme and talk about a kind of Google map sort of view. So pull right back and look at this system in a much broader context, which might be looking at the whole state or the whole nation even, about why is overgrazing becoming more prevalent across multiple sites, etc. And that's just a way, again, of changing scales, and that helps us to look at different ways that this system might have changed in the past by just getting a sense of scales. And it also helps us to build up this picture of what are the important scales when we're doing this scoping work. Lastly, we might think about taking a happy snap. So what would this system look like if that problem was fixed? So what would the picture look like? And that gives us a sense of the direction that people might want to move in. But again, it also helps us to understand the current system. If people are saying, well, the happy snap would involve people being more settled back up here and not moving their cattle to the wetlands, that gives us some indications of, the dynamics of the system. And we can then ask questions, well, what's stopping people from doing that now? How come that hasn't happened? Again, that's giving us a deeper insight into the current system. And then finally, I would say the last step is to come back to that original picture here, the original picture that people sort of described, and say, do we understand this system differently now that we've done all of that zooming in and out and using different scales? What can we describe about this system now and this issue? And hopefully what you see, and this is what does usually happen in practice, is that people start to describe that problem or that issue in a broader system context. So as you've gone through that using that tool, of course, people are describing the system, and that's what we want. We're in the scoping phase, but they're also learning about the system and its dynamics, and you're learning about the system and its dynamics as well. And so by going through those processes of zooming in and zooming out and understanding scale, we're building up a richer picture of the system. So those three tools are ones that I would use if, in any kind of setting. And the thing that would make me decide which one am I going to use is these two are very focused on, as I say, the kind of broader, just exploratory kind of thinking. This is much more focused on zooming in onto a particular issue. And so that would be the choice I would be making if I was trying to decide between these tools. So there we go. I hope that's useful. And I hope that you have a chance in the discussion with me, Selberg, in the lab to go over and talk about some of these things and get to use some of these tools in practice. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the course. Best of luck. Thank you.